I want to thank you for your time and your expertise, David. Thank you.
Welcome, glad to be here. And in the talks that I give, that I have said that there is a unofficial rule that if you're going to talk about the Saluda Grade, you got to show a picture of a train. So this is me meeting the rules of talking about the Saluda Grade. And the Saluda Grade, I think that outside we have one of the best descriptions of this, that for your bragging rights, we are the steepest section of track in the country, but it's got to be standard gauge commercial. So it's like I tell my patrons, we don't go in competition with roller coasters and things like that. So steepest commercial standard gauge in the country. And if you're curious about gauge, here's a nice little machine for measuring it. But that's just the width between the rails. Now, they were coming up the hill and being the steepest, just to familiarize you with that here we have a map of what's considered to be the Saluda Grade, starts at the post office and goes down to just beyond Pearson Falls, or here, this is Pearson Falls Road and Fort Creek Road, and that's the bottom of the grade. And so then it's 2.7 miles to get up 650 feet. So that average is 4.7%. Now, here's just a map of the elevation change. So here is Melrose Station, which is down at Fort Creek Road, goes all the way up, and right here is where the post office is. So that is what the Saluda Grade does. Now, it'll come up later, but just keep in the back of your mind that this section of track, just right outside of our door, doesn't look like it's that steep, but it's actually going downhill again. So that made for an interesting challenge for some of the parts of the railroad. So a standard question that is worth asking is, why do we run the train up the hill? So that would take a little bit of talking, but the ultimate desire from the people in Charleston, South Carolina, were thinking that, just think if we had rail connection to the Ohio River, what that could do for our harbor. The only thing that they had was what's called the best friend of Charleston. But remember, this was like 1831. So your only other choice for getting around, stagecoach, horse cart, walk, you didn't jump in your car and just go. So the idea that this rail thing is going to catch on, that they said, yes, it is. And it had caught on a little bit in Europe, but not to a tremendous extent. But at any rate, they wanted to get to the Ohio River, and so then it was in 1835 that South Carolina chartered the Louisville, Cincinnati, Charleston Railroad, which again was very foresightful thinking. One of the individuals who helped foster this dream was a man that they dressed me up as, Joel Poinsett. And he did his studies as a youngster in England. And there, I think he got a high level of appreciation for the roads, the small trains that were there, and what the interconnection of transportation systems, what positive effect that had on the economy of the local communities. So he brought that back over to South Carolina with him, and they assigned him to be a state legislator, and which he did. And so then I think this concept from England kind of spurred, so Joel Poinsett was very big into transportation things. Hence, we always contend that Route 25 is basically a route that he initially laid out as being a good place to go. And we know that there is the Poinsett Bridge down in the Greenville watershed. And one of the unofficial rules in Greenville, South Carolina, is that every city block has got to have something on it named Poinsett. And so they've done a reasonably good job of that. So that was the dream that they had, and whenever you look at a map of the country, here we got Charleston, here we got Louisville, there we got Cincinnati, and what's in the center of the triangle? There you got Saluda. So you can see that this track coming up through Saluda was very much a part of this. I contend that this ought to be thought of as the north-south transcontinental railroad. But that was what they were going. Now, to bring this out, they had to spend a lot of time from here down to here in North Carolina. And North Carolina was pushing back just a little bit. And I'm sure you find it amazing to think that North Carolina might push back against a South Carolina idea. But that's the way that it went. So North Carolina kind of looked at a map and said, you know what? Georgia's got a harbor in Savannah. South Carolina's got a harbor in Charleston. Virginia's got a harbor in Norfolk. We don't have anything. And so then they thought, if we're going to go to all the trouble of trying to put in a railroad, and this, like I say, this rail thing catches on, let's go east-west from Asheville to the coast, either Wilmington or what is now Morehead City. And so then North Carolina was in a little bit of competition with this South Carolina, Charleston-Louisville Railroad. And in looking at this, the people, I always intend that the North Carolina was playing the field of dreams, that if we build it, maybe they will come. And so the people in Asheville and in western North Carolina and all the mountains for generations had always been doing business with the low country of South Carolina. So they would come up here to the Blue Ridge Escarpment, which Saluda is the first city at the top of the escarpment, and go down and then do their business in South Carolina, make their money, and come back home. And according to Matt Bumgardner, the author of many books around here and a lot of donations, he wrote in there that they figured that all these people out to the east, that might as well have been the man in the moon. We don't know who they are. We don't do business with them. We don't know anything about them. So the people in Asheville were much more in favor of the South Carolina route than they were the North Carolina, Western North Carolina Railroad. So the race to Asheville was on. Now, the other similarity to the Transcontinental Railroad is that they had started building railroads south from Louisville, Cincinnati, and north from Charleston, Columbia. And the golden spike would have been driven in Asheville. So that was the race for all these railroads, that this would be the final connection. And so North Carolina in 1848 started the Central Railroad Plan, and they loved the idea of the Western North Carolina Railroad, which was to connect Asheville to Salisbury. And they had that, and by the time of the Civil War, that they had only gotten as far west as Morganton. And then after the Civil War, I'm sure it was just coincidence, but it seems as if the president of the company and all the money disappeared about the same time. And so then that kind of called for a little bit of reorganization. Then they started the South Carolina dream, was the Spartanburg and Asheville Railroad. And they had made it up to Columbia in the 1840s. And then finally in 1872, they made it to Spartanburg. And so then that was quite the thing. And they were trying to get the permission and the support and the funding from North Carolina, but there was an argument over gauge. And the South all seem to have their tracks as broad gauge, which means there's 5 feet between the rails. The Transcontinental Railroad and all the railroads to the north were standard gauge, which was 4 feet, 8.5 inches between the rails. So that made it a little difficulty just to go from one to the other with the same train. And that's kind of one of the gists, from I remember 100 years ago, that the movie, The General, that one of the keys to that was the fact that the northern troops that stole the train could only get it so far north because then the gauge changed. So part of that Walt Disney story was part of this gauge thing. But North Carolina also agreed finally that maybe we could come to terms with the standard, or with the same gauge. So they started talking about it, and things were moving on with it. But we can see that the Western North Carolina Railroad picked up, and they finally made it from Salisbury and across all the old fort loops into Asheville in 1881. And what became the Asheville and Spartanburg Railway made it to Asheville in July of 1886. So that was a little bit of the history of what was coming up this line here. Now, as all the railroad companies, most all of them did, that they started building, they started selling stock, they started buying land and laying track, and they run into financial difficulty. And that is what the Spartanburg and Asheville Railroad ran into, financial difficulty. So they refinanced, they got some loans from other companies and that type of thing, and they changed their name to the Asheville and Spartanburg. So you can, if you talk about the early parts of the track, it was the Spartanburg and Asheville Company, but the later one that made it to Asheville was the Asheville and Spartanburg Company. But that was those. And now, the Spartanburg and Asheville Company had 3 things going for it. One, or two of the major things that were helpful was their major architect and their chief engineer were 2 officers from the CSA, but Thaddeus Coleman and Charles Pearson. And they had tremendous insight, tremendous experience. And if I had mentioned earlier, if you remember whenever the funds for the Western North Carolina disappeared, that they kind of reorganized, well, that was very helpful because these very experienced gentlemen were looking for something to do with their time. So they joined the Asheville and Spartanburg Railroad, and the Spartanburg and Asheville, depending on what year you talk about. So that was very, very beneficial because they had tremendous experience and insight into this. And North Carolina agreed to provide convict later, and now Asheville got very enthusiastic again about trains because they were going to have connection to the low country of South Carolina. So they were happy. So in this period of time, that these were some of the things that they had going for them to help lay these tracks that are right out there. And here's the financial, but the groundbreaking ceremony was held in Spartanburg in 1874. So that's when they were going to start coming up the Blue Ridge Escarpment. One of the items going was how do you get there? Because I like to use the picture that Thaddeus Coleman and Charles Pearson just had kind of meandered up to the state line from Spartanburg, looked to the west, and said, oh, shucky darn, because they were looking at the Blue Ridge Escarpment. And I use my layman's definition of an escarpment is there aren't any foothills. And so then you just have to come up a cliff. And they had all kinds of plans of let us go up from Tryon to Columbus, go over north of White Oak Mountain, come back down, make our way to Flat Rock and to Hendersonville, only need 13 trestles and 2 tunnels, and everything will be great. But Captain Pearson, with his experience, looked out there and said, the ground's no good. Follow the Pacolet River up. And everybody said, it's way too steep, you're going to get us all killed. Now, it highly amused me because I was in here, it was at least 3 years ago or more, and Captain Pearson's granddaughter came in, and we were talking, and we had just a fantastic chat. She was the sharpest, wittiest 90-year-old woman that I've ever had the privilege of talking with. And so after kicking things around a little bit, and she told me that Granddaddy told him, the ground's no good over there. And then she threw her shoulders back and was just as proud as the day is long and said, and I-26 proved Granddaddy right. It was delayed 8 years in opening while they were trying to figure out how to get that mountain just to hold an interstate highway. So, and I-26 proved Granddaddy right. So that was a lot of fun. But that is why he said, follow the Pacolet River up. And the Monday morning quarterbacks had said, oh my goodness, you're going to all get us killed. And this was the problem, because coming up here in that route, the Saluda grade averages roughly 5% grade. If you're an engineer, it's really 4.7%, but that's okay, 5% is close enough. Old steam engines didn't like anything steeper than 2%. And so that was part of the difficulty. Now, they sat down and talked about it a little bit, and they had ways of getting around this problem. And one of them was to put a helper engine on the back of the train. And the other thing they did was with longer freight trains, they could split them up into thirds. Hence, down at the bottom of the grade at Melrose, there's quite an extensive run of tracks and things like that, because not only did you have the main line, but you had to have several tracks to store parts of freight trains on. And also you had these helper engines that were stationed down there, and they needed servicing, coal, water, and all of that type of thing. So Melrose Station was, at least to a train, was quite a happening place. And I find it interesting that I think the idea of a helper took off because in the western part of the country, with all of those mountains, in Utah, there is a town in Utah named Helper, Utah. And Wikipedia will tell you it is named after this engine. So the helper was embraced by the entire industry and splitting the train up into thirds. Now, coming down the tracks, if you had kind of lost your brakes, you had a few problems. And this happened upon occasion to the point that I contend the Saluda grade helped change the way that engineers talked with each other. And so then, how many derailments have you had, Frank? Not sure, Jim. It's hard to keep track. So that was their communication. And there were many wrecks. So we had, this is just a picture of one of the steam engines that didn't make it. Here's a diesel. This was from 1964, but they were having problems. So in the first 25 or 26 years of operation, that if you count up all the fatalities in Matt Baumgartner's book, 31 employees had been killed in runaways. And that was a record that Southern was not real impressed with. So Southern took over control of the railroads in 1894, but in the 1890 type of thing. Prior to that, they had been run by smaller companies, just kind of a checkerboard of different companies running them. And many of those companies, like like railroad companies now, were in receivership, and Southern kind of absorbed them into one place. Now this map on the wall back here, you can see the extent of the southern railroad lines, covering the entire southeast portion of the United States. So that was Southern coming in, and they were concerned about safety. And I liked them because the smaller companies couldn't afford to be safe. And I think I said that very politely, but I contend that they wanted the same macho image of the maritime industry, that the captain goes down with his ship, and they were saying the engineer stays with his train. Southern didn't like that. They wanted to change that. They felt that the decision to leave a runaway train should be the engineer and the crew, not somebody sitting behind a desk in Asheville. So I use a little bit of the quip that in the aerospace business that I spent a little bit of time in, that we used to have a saying that a good landing is when you can walk away from the plane. A great landing is when you can walk away and use the plane again. And I contend that Southern was saying a good engineer stays with his train. A great engineer knows when to get off. So in order to do that, just below the little tunnel on Pearson Falls Road, they actually cleaned out an area there, removed all the boulders, all the thistles, all the trees, didn't have to worry about the kudzu back then, and covered it with sand. And that is known as Sand Cut. I mean, the name on the dirt road is Sand Cut View. And Sand Cut was a company-supplied place, which was the last good jump-off point if you were on a runaway. So that's how Southern was trying to emphasize their concern over safety, was through the implementation of Sand Cut. Then they went for 9 years and didn't have any problems until 1903. Summer of 1903, they had 3 major incidences, major wrecks. And the first one in July was Pit Ballou was the engineer. And they were coming down just before the tunnel on Pearson Falls Road, lost their brakes, and the crew jumped off, except he, for some reason, stayed on. Train got up to 40, 45 miles an hour, and he decided it was about time to jump. So he did, and it was a good idea because the train went another 100 yards and then rolled over, which would have killed him. But at any rate, he broke his back in jumping off the train and was in Asheville Hospital recovering from that. Now, there was another train in summer of 1903, which was coming up the hill, lost traction, and it skidded all the way past Tryon. And then a third train, tragically, was the youngest engineer to go down the hill, and he lost his brakes, and in a sharp right turn at the bottom of the hill, his train rolled and he was killed. So they had their fatality. Now, that sharp right turn to this day is known as Slaughter Pen Cut. So Southern did not like that, so they put out the All Points Bulletin to all their employees and said, tell us how to improve the safety of the Saluda Grade, or we're shutting it down. Pit Ballou, in his hospital bed, said, oh, you can't shut it down. No way. So he came up to the conclusion that, okay, gravity got us into this situation. I'll bet gravity can get us out. So he called in the maintenance supervision and explained the concept of a safety runoff track. And it was August of 1903, he explained this to the supervision. And these were functioning by the end of December of 1903. But that was Pit Ballou and the safety runoff tracks. So they thought that was a great idea, put them in. There's one of them, safety runoff track number 1. Here's another one, that safety runoff track number 2 that is down at Melrose. You can still see those tracks there. And they are analogous Most times we tell people this, the patrons, and they point out that, oh yeah, that's like on the interstate highway system. And so then there's I-26, and sure enough, you've got your truck ramps, just like the train ramps. Now, I tried to find a picture of a runaway truck that would have been utilizing one of these ramps. But the only truck that I could find that was running away was that one. So that's our runaway truck, which is a little bit different from our runaway train. This was the coal train that wrecked in 1971, and that is safety runoff track number 1, that it didn't make it up. There was some things that were going on here, like the safety runoff track saved a train in 1916 whenever the Great Hurricane came through and flooded things out and wiped out the trestle down at Melrose. And they could telegraph to the operator. There was one passenger train that was still coming. They said, don't let that train pass. So it went up the runoff track, and the engineer would be just madder than blazes, jumped out, and I'm sure that he called the switchman many names. But the switchman said, you know, no offense, but I just saved your train, I just saved your life, and I saved all your passengers. So that was 1916. And then this one, there was the only one more fatality on the grade after that, and that was in 1940, and it poignantly occurred at the end of safety runoff track number 1, that there was a fireman that stayed with the train. It was going so fast that it went off the end of the runoff track, and all the coal and everything that was in it and in the boiler came rushing forward and crushed him. He lived for a day. But I never could figure out why the whole rest of the crew, why the engineer was gone, why the brakeman was gone, but the fireman stayed. And finally, a couple years ago, I saw an individual very intently looking through our windows, and I went and introduced myself, and he said, I am the grandson of the last man to die on the grade. And whenever I said 1940 into safety runoff track number 1, and a fireman. And he said, you're exactly correct. I says, come on in, we're gonna talk. And so in that chat, he said the family lore was this fireman had backed up kind of against the boiler to allow the fireman and the engineer and the brakeman off. And the heavy cast door clipped over the heels of his boots, and he was trapped on the train. And so then that is why he was still on the train. So getting to talk to his grandson, I've got my plausible explanation for why he was there. The first diesel up the hill, diesel engine, 1949. And by 1955, the transition had been made so that all the trains on the Saluda Grade, all the prime movers, were diesel engines. Caused them to be much more forgiving to the steepness of the grade. And a lot of people don't recognize, but the only thing the diesel engine does on a diesel engine is run a DC generator, that the wheels are all driven by DC motors. So you can hear, and I heard one guy Thursday refer to it as an electric diesel, but we just call them diesel engines, but they're run by electric motors. And so that is very smooth torque transfer. Whereas on a steam engine, you got bump, bump, bump. So the average torque might be the same, but the torque spike is much, much higher on a steam engine than it would be on a diesel engine. And so then that lack of that spiking made it more susceptible for easy of going up the hill. And another thing was that it had, if you go all the way back to maybe your 11th grade physics class, that you can rewire a DC electric motor and it becomes an electric generator. And so then they had that wiring in all the diesel engines so you could flick a switch, take your foot off the gas, figuratively speaking, and the brakes would slow down because they were generating electricity. And they're in diesel locomotives, there's massive heat transfer units to convert that electricity energy into thermal energy. So dynamic braking was another great benefit. I say that if you were on a steam engine and you pop the clutch, you don't get more steam. But on a diesel engine, you can pop the clutch and get more electricity. So dynamic braking was very important to this introduction of diesels. And also, thanks to Mr. Westinghouse, all the boxcars, all the cars in the big freight train have air brakes on them, and a compressor has to fill those air brakes. And that would take a great deal of time whenever you consider you could have a coal train a mile long, and you've got one little compressor that has got to pressurize that tube. So the diesel had much more efficient runs. Now, one of the items with the introduction of the diesels was that the helpers were not needed near as much. They still cut the train into thirds, but they didn't need to have another engine push it up the hill. And in 1955, they got permission from the government to eliminate safety runoff track number 1. So whenever you happen to be walking the grade, finding safety runoff track number 1 is a very significant challenge, because you just find an old road bed that kind of looks like it's going down there. Safety runoff track number 2, the tracks are still there. That's real easy to find. But that was some of the things that they did. And then if you remember, whenever I showed you the aerial map of the grade, that trying to take a long freight train and balance it over that knife edge was a challenge. So that's where they incorporated stopboard number 2, was to help balancing the long freight trains. So that was the diesels came in, and that was a pretty good deal. One of the items which I contend was the Louisville, Cincinnati, Charleston Railroad. They were interested in moving freight around. And yet, whenever they opened up, they found out that people were also a very productive cargo. So, passenger service then became important. And I enjoy telling people, especially from South Carolina, that when the people in Charleston finally realized you could both breathe and sleep in the summertime, they were coming up here in droves. And so then the passengers were quite a very productive business, so to speak. And that was part of the justification and the great desire to get the railroad completed to Asheville, was because we wanted to ride the train to Asheville. So passenger service helped justify getting the route to Asheville in 1886. And also there was a special line that was made down to Lake Toxaway, which was the Transylvania Railroad, and it's maybe something to do with Transylvania County, but that was just for moving people around. And then also that people usually bring money with them, so that's not too shabby. And that railroads also were responsible for building several hotels and that type of thing, just, yes, to incorporate. So, traveling up the grade, 1893, 41,000 passengers came up. But in 1902, 1/3 Now, this is not coming to Saluda, but it's like on a passenger train coming, just up the track. So that was enough, so Southern Railway decided to build this building in 1903. One of the items that they had was the passenger service justified the Carolina Special, which was very famous for a great number of years. And you can see that even like in 1911, or in that general running area, that you could actually take a train from Miami to Chicago. In the early 1900s, that was a major accomplishment to be able to do that. And then everyone had a car, everyone had access to the interstates. They had figured out how to get the mountain to hold I-26. And so then they figured on December 5th, 1968, that we no longer need passenger service. So it was this building and the depots and passenger service were shut down. And So it stayed as an empty building for 14 years because it shut down in 1968. And then in 1982, that Norfolk and Western merged with Southern. And the Norfolk and Western management, I think, maybe had a little bit more business acumen, even though Bo Brown told me that they just didn't like anything that had Southern on it. And but they told Saluda, either you do something with the depot or we're tearing it down. We don't like empty buildings on our easement. So Saluda got this area, and a couple families put a foundation in here, and in 1984, they moved it, the building, lock, stock, and barrel, just in one piece. And so that is moving day for the depot. Here it's finally coming into place. You recognize that this is the visitor center and where Jim Carson's got his building. And
was the depot across the tracks?
no,
Or was
it was on this
side
side of the track.
Still on this side?
Yeah, it was on this side of the track, just 400 yards down the tracks. There's a big pile of rocks and stuff there, and that's where it was. So, yeah, but that was the moving day for the depot. Now, this is a picture of a coal train, and this was one of the prime, especially after 1968, this was the prime financial input for the railroad. And they were delivering coal from Andover, Virginia, to the Belmont Duke Power Station that's just west of Charlotte. So it's like you'd come down from Andover, go through Asheville, Saluda, Spartanburg, turn left, and go to Belmont. But then the Belmont coal station, for various and sundry reasons, decided to start using coal from West Virginia, which meant that you would come down through Salisbury, Greensboro, Charlotte to get there. So they lost the coal business. And in losing the coal business, it was no longer financially feasible to run the Saluda Grade, because getting down the Saluda Grade was very challenging for them. And one of the things that they did, they had to stop the trains, set the brake retainers, and take a lot of time. Down below, they'd have to cut the freight trains into thirds, bring them up here, set them up again. And they had one gentleman, which was stationed in Hendersonville, and he was the road foreman of engines. And he was the man that was used to take every freight train down the grade. So they had what was analogous to a harbor pilot. But the main train engineer stepped aside and the road foreman took it down the hill. So running the Saluda Grade was a very expensive proposition. And I imagine that they, looking at the numbers, were not the least bit disappointed that it no longer is profitable to run. So that is where December 1st of 2001 was the last train on these tracks. So 2003, they took them out of service. And this will be quick, but I just thought it was interesting to see when they took it out of service, they didn't just hang up a sign that said closed. They took a dump truck full of ballast and dumped on the track. And they took a cutting torch and split the rails. So this is up in Tuxedo at milepost 26 where they cut it. This is down in Landrum across from Lynn's engine repair shop. And this is what they've got. So whenever they say taken out of service, they meant it seriously. So that meant this building stayed empty for 14 years. Anybody that had a pickup truck or a horse cart borrowed things out of it. It tried to be retail businesses, either gift shop, excuse me, gift shops, deli, coffee shops, but it didn't quite financially work out that well. So then in 2015, another very insightful group of people decided Saluda needed a museum. And so then that's where this 501c3 facility was born. And so then there is our Saluda Museum, and somewhere along the line it got painted green and yellow. And for all the years I spent working for John Deere, I'm kind of drawn to green and yellow. But we can have groups, and I really don't have to show you what the inside looks like because you're sitting in it. But this is our diorama, this is this suite. But I would like to point out, as you were coming in, we have a little new electronic feature, the kiosk. And we ask anybody that comes in, whether you're just selling Amway or you're interested in trains or what, but we would like to get the number of adults and your zip code. And we use that information because I've got a program supplied by the post office where I've got the latitude and longitude of every zip code, in addition to what town and state it is. And I can make a map, which is a distribution of where our visitors have come from. And so then that has been we think, to be very beneficial, particularly whenever we can segment out much closer than this, like what percentage of patrons were in Polk County, what percentage from Henderson County, because then those counties can donate money to us. So that's the reason why we sometimes fanatically are asking for your zip code, is for this population density map. And so then the ticket office was made into that kind of show, and this is the far room, which has a tremendous amount of things from Matt Baumgartner's estate, and does very well. And if you have a sweet tooth, you can go to the baggage room and get you an ice cream cone. If you've got too much energy from eating all of that ice cream, you can play on Thomas the Train, which is right out there. So that concludes my talk, and I thank you. And if it's,
Let's give Dave a big hand.
thank you.